Hi, this is Anna, and you're listening to Sustainability Explored. I'm your guide to the world of corporate social responsibility, environment, social risks, circular economy, and many more. Today, I'm recording this podcast episode from Paris, where I'm attending the workshop or a conference called Energy Transition and Climate Change. Is there a European answer? This episode is brought to you by and supported fully by United Europe. United Europe is an initiative dedicated to the idea of a strong and competitive Europe which can defend its common interests yet respects the diversity of its people. Within the young professional seminars, such as the one we are attending today, United Europe wishes to rekindle the younger generation's enthusiasm for Europe, help it to build a network that stretches across Europe and contributes to solutions for Europe's current problems. One of such problems is the energy transition and global warming that presents us with one of the biggest economic and social challenges in the coming decades and even today. With annually rising temperatures, melting polar ice caps, and increasing number of hurricanes and floods, the overwhelming evidence and consensus among climate scientists is that man-made climate change is real, and it's happening right now. This possesses a significant threat for global economies and people's lives in the form of potential major human displacements due to floods and droughts or just malnutrition and famine. Given that current policies, the parties to the Paris Climate Agreement, or COP21, set in December 2015, are still far from being on track to meet the goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees. It is questionable whether further global warming can be slowed down or even stopped completely under the given conditions. It is unclear how a European or global solution to the problem can be found. So many countries around the world are actually embarking on the transition to sustainable energy system. These transitions will involve fundamental and interrelated changes in technologies and fuels used, infrastructure built, policies employed, markets and institutions. The historic Paris Agreement that I mentioned earlier on climate change sets the course for a fundamental transformation on the global economy over the next decades. Achieving the deep cuts in global carbon emissions that this vision of limiting global average temperature rise to well below 2 degrees requires is no small task given the enormous challenge of implementing and eventually exceeding current country climate pledges, or countries as we're talking about the European Union. So here with me today, I'm having a bunch of extraordinary guests and professionals. Markus Leopold, who is an energy expert and advisor. He has worked for major global energy companies and the EU public regulator for the past 28 years, where he held several management positions in Europe and the USA. He is also a long-standing member of the United Europe. Dinaan Drankier, a policy officer from the field of bioenergy in the Netherlands. Nevena Milutinovic, project coordinator in the engineering company in Serbia. And Mihkel Kajevac, strategy writer of the city of Tallinn. So, hello, dear guests.
Hi, hello.
Hi there.
The first question will go probably to Markus. For those listeners and those who are following the podcast Sustainability Explored, to introduce them a little bit more to the topic, what are we talking about? What is the energy transition and what do we mean when we say that?
Well, maybe let me start from the basics then. Society has always had a certain energy mix. In the past, if you go back 400 years, a large part of that was made up of wood, just basically burning biomaterials. Then during the Industrial Revolution, coal got into the mix, made up a huge part of it, and in a large part enabled the Industrial Revolution actually. In the 1950s then, oil came into the fold, and you had the Middle East coming up in prominence. And then maybe 15 years back, natural gas was also increasing significantly in its share. So when you talk about energy transition, it is really the change in the mix of the fuels that heat our houses, that power our transportation system, that allow our production processes. I think the interesting question nowadays is, especially as climate change and food production have become significant topics. In the past, if you go from one fuel to the next major fuel, so the change from wood to coal and from coal to oil typically took about 40 to 50 years. And I think the question that we are debating nowadays is, because of climate change and the conviction that we need to change our energy mix, can that happen at a much faster pace, or is it the same 30, 40, 50 years? And the significant change in terms of beating the clock on the change is technological development. So currently, many different technologies are being looked at. A lot are promising. There are no guarantees. The jury is still out on how to best do it, but that is the challenge everyone is basically working on nowadays. How to most quickly get to the energy mix that we think we need in order to live sustainably, resilient, and not have a negative impact on the environment.
Do you think we are talking today about the ways to reduce also our energy consumption rather than change or transition from the energy mix? Is it on the agenda even?
I think implicitly people are aware that certainly if you look at the decarbonization scenarios, which are now being discussed up to 2050, that you need massive consumer change. I think it has not really dawned on a lot of people yet that it will massively disrupt the lives the way they are currently being led, but it will have to be a major change in consumer behavior. It will be addressed, but I think we're certainly not there yet in terms of people needing to make, if you will, certain sacrifices or just different choices. Because this doesn't have to be a negative, limiting choice only, I think. If we do it in a clever way, then I think it's going to be not necessarily painful, but just different, the way we live.
You mentioned consumer change, consumer behavior. Here I assume we're talking about households and individuals, but as well companies. And that inevitably leads me to the next question. To influence the behavior of companies, what are the political changes? What are the governmental changes, the legal changes and kind of requirements to make this happen? I would like to address this question to Dinan Drankier, the policy officer currently working in the Netherlands.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that's a very good question. Well, as a government, you have various policy instruments at your disposal. Traditionally, we always distinguish more or less three of them. You can use stimulative elements, so you can, for example, through subsidies, stimulate companies to take a certain pathway to do a certain thing. You can come up with requirements. So, for example, you can require an energy supplier to supply a certain amount of renewable energy. And a third way is other more facilitative elements. For example, innovation subsidies to facilitate innovation. For example, a field in which I personally work is bioenergy. Well, changing the way the grid is managed, making other rules for grid management can also facilitate an uptake of, for example, biomethane. So through these three instruments, you try to, to stimulate or to push companies to take a certain pathway.
Would it be right to say that, for example, in the case, anyone can jump in here, but in case of Netherlands, are there massive coal, oil industries that would be aggressively lobbying against this change?
I would argue from a personal perspective that in the Netherlands we have quite a consistential democracy model, so we really work together quite a lot. It's the traditional polder model, it's often called. And I think a good example of that is our recent climate agreement. In 2019, more than 100 parties in the Netherlands collectively signed a climate agreement, and in that climate agreement these parties, which are companies, which are governments, which are NGOs, they collectively decided on a set of measures to come to a 49% CO2 reduction in 2030. So it's measures can be difficult, can be painful, but through including all parties you can find a middle ground which provides for a good way forward.
Mikael, as a strategy writer for the city of Tallinn, what's the timeline of your strategy? Until when do you set the goals? And maybe you can share some, steps and action plan, or some steps that you include in your strategy for Estonia and specifically the city of Tallinn in terms of energy transition and climate change.
Thank you very much. Basically, we can say that the world is urbanizing very fast. This means that an important part of the energy transition is going to be played out in cities and how cities use energy. Of course, it's not only like city is not a self-contained mechanism. For example, I can say on the example of Estonia that also if Tallinn were to be the most forward running front runner in energy transformation, the country of Estonia is not. We have like 80% of our energy comes from not even coal. We have a very strange and not very common energy source, which is oil shale. Only like Jordan and the United States also use it, but let's say it's in the league of coal. It's very polluting, and it also actually means that Estonia is the only country in Europe where, for example, taking an electric car would actually pollute more than a normal gasoline car. So we cannot take things in isolation, but I will take the liberty of where from Dinant you asked from company behavior, I will take the consumer part then, because you divided it before in two. And I think the cities have quite a big effect on consumer, how we consume energy. And this actually means that lifestyles in a way have to change. This means that maybe we should not take the personal car and drive it alone to work, where we park it 95% of a car's lifetime. It stays parked. It has climate implications. it has air pollution implications, but it also has other implications which are not climate related, at least not directly. It also has, for example, implications of space. If you have to build big roads and parking lots, then you cannot build parks and city squares. This is, in a simplistic way, the logic. So we tried to take with the Tallinn 2035 strategy, which also self-explains the timeline. We tried to take this kind of holistic and proactive role in designing also these consumer behaviors, because in local governments, basically where you invest, where you put your money, you get the results. For example, Tallinn in the last 20 years has invested most of its investment money into roads, and surprise, surprise, we have actually 140 more cars per 1,000 people than the European median. So Tallinn is heavily car-centered. Now, it doesn't only mean that roads are better for cars. It also means that every euro you invest into a road, you cannot invest into trams or bicycle lanes or whatever. This tilts the picture even more. So with the new strategy, we aim to create an environment which stands on four pillars, and the first is mobility. I'll bring it first, but there is no actual order. Mobility, which should be more active. Active means that actually in city space you have walking and cycling preferred. They are the least carbon emitting, we might say zero emitting mobilities. Then public transport, which forms good public transport, which corresponds to the needs of people and might be also defined in another way as a multimodal transport, that you, for example, have an app and first take the car, then the tram, and for the last kilometer maybe an electric scooter, and leave car mobility as the last one, not to harass car owners, but actually to provide possibilities for everybody else, because now it's certainly off balance. It is accompanied by a network of greenery, and we aim to make it as uninterrupted as possible. And in Tallinn, strangely enough, it is, as it is quite a dispersed city, it is quite possible to make uninterrupted green networks, which will provide like also possibilities for mobility, but they also provide lungs for the city. They provide also possibilities to let's say hold or maintain the biodiversity, and also like project have better mental health, have happier citizens. And like the third and the fourth pillar are good public space, which means then city piazzas and events going on good city streets, not roads, not car roads, but city streets. And the last, which then encircles everything, is creating this kind of space for learning and innovation, because there are enough studies to suggest that if people actually bump into each other, if people see each other by chance, there is, and then you maybe chat or you make some kind of other heureka moment, there is more innovation, there is more interaction between people, less loneliness, important, more learning from each other, and I think most importantly of all, societies that have more like this kind of public interaction have less segregation, so everything is united. Of course, there are other very important topics which support these four pillars, but we perceive these four as the most important ones.
Thank you very much. I heard recently from another Estonian colleague about so-called green electricity certificate, which kind of allows you to buy a paper probably that ensures your electricity to your household is coming only from the renewable energy sources. Could you share a little bit more on how this system works, how much maybe does it cost, and how, most importantly, how acceptive people in general are of this idea?
Mm-hmm. I'm no expert on this, but basically yes, it's a consumer option. While I was very critical of Estonian energy production, we actually have made good progress also. Notwithstanding that it was easy progress, we have met and exceeded the 2020 goals already now for renewable energy, and this basically means that your energy comes from solar. If you choose this electricity product with this label, then it means that it comes from solar, wind. We don't have much hydro, but it all comes from renewable sources. In part, it's also biomass, of which there is also, let's say, in partly I would also be critical, because sometimes it's at least in Estonia, it's also greenwashing, but let's say at least the intention is there. And it means that your energy will cost a bit more, which of course makes it a very good option for a vegan cafe, which charges €4 for a coffee, and also for consumers who are better off. Nevertheless, for people who are not so well off and actually are struggling to remain afloat, of course, they go for the cheapest option and run on oil shale as since the 30s.
Thank you very much for sharing. Now I would like to leave a little bit the European Union, technically speaking, and shift a little bit to the Balkans. Nevena, on the example of Serbia, how is the government tackling the climate change? Are there any particular steps undertaken so far? And what is happening in the energy transition if anything does happen at all in Serbia?
Thank you. We'll start with the energy transition, and unfortunately there are no major steps in transition. So for the past few decades, the most of energy mix comes from the coal, I think more than 60%. Then next one is hydropower, and then of course oil. In that sense, Serbia is dependent on Russian oil, and there was a project of South Stream that actually haven't been realized. So now we are still dependent on oil from Russia that comes from Hungary and Ukraine. So in that sense, so there, I don't think there is a major idea or policies on how to shift to renewables. And honestly, I don't see even any policies that would back that up. And as for environment, like few weeks ago, actually Belgrade set a negative example. The capital was the most polluted city in Europe. And as for the energy efficiency, also I don't think that we are really good examples. So because there are the numbers of which states that Serbia it's very energy insufficient because we spend at least twice as much energy than the average European, so in terms of households. So I feel like that there is really the need and from the government, and they also signed the agreements with EU that makes them obliged to follow it. But I don't think on everyday and a daily basis level that there are some changes. So hopefully that would change. Thank you.
Speaking of the changes and the timelines that we have, yesterday I heard an interesting thought. The planet will be there. The question is whether the humans will still be there when the temperatures rise, right? There is a very ambitious goal to keep, quote unquote, well below 2 degrees, the temperature below 2 degrees. Marcus, what are your estimations, maybe predictions? What do you see happening? How much time do we have, and maybe what to do?
Well, a couple of thoughts maybe. We're all Europeans around the table. Europe's greenhouse gas emissions are 9% of the global share, or 8%. Europe is not the biggest problem. Even if we were carbon neutral by 2050, if no other region were to follow and would stay on their current trajectories, overall we wouldn't be able to change that much. So one question is, assuming we're successful in our energy transition towards decarbonization, how do we best pull others along? Meaning whichever projects and changes we make, first of all, they need to make sense for Europe in its own right. I'm quite convinced that others will then naturally follow. If it is projects where Europe really benefits, others would want to copy this. Prior to others being able to see the successes, there might be intermediate steps, which is corporations with think tanks, with companies with more proven technologies already going out globally. So maybe the timeline can be shortened. Another important point for me is whenever we talk about COP21 and keeping the temperature rises to well below 2 degrees, around 1.5, there's still many people that say, well, it is, if my summers tend to be 1.5 degrees higher, maybe it's actually not that bad, or even 2% or 3% higher. Is it really that crucial that we try to set everything in motion now? Shouldn't we wait a bit until it becomes clearer? I think it's important to view the world as such and the natural environment just like our human bodies. With 37 degrees, we are perfectly healthy. At 2% higher, 39 degrees, we are extremely sick. The same is true for the natural environment. So if we're talking 2-3% increases in temperature, it is significant, and we do not know what the changes will be. You then immediately come on to, should you just look at mitigation? Should you do mitigation adaptation at the same time? There are various different histories in terms of just the EU member states, but also elsewhere in the world. What I'm saying is, I think it is a serious enough challenge that needs to be tackled now. How successful we will be in terms of adapting, mitigating, reversing it, I don't know. Certainly technology will play a big part of it. As consumers and as employees and as business leaders, we need to stay very flexible, not rooted in the past, and just be a bit more willing to also play, test, fail, and if we are successful in keeping the our personal energy levels and going for these sort of changes and allowing for them, I'm still quite optimistic. But how successful, by when we will be, I really don't know.
I'd like to pick up on Markus's saying that Europe is only 8% and continue from his thought that Europe is an example. Because, for example, I was born in the Soviet Union. It's really crazy to think about it, but I was. And I've seen and you too, yeah, of course. And I've seen when we got independent, and I've seen this like admiration for the Western way of life. Now that we have almost or getting there, I can say that this model of life doesn't have to be this consumerist, this way. It doesn't have to be so energy rich. So as for the effect Europe can give to the energy transition, it's in big part it's like being a good model instead of a bad model, and of course like help others to make the transitions by knowledge, maybe investments and good incentives.
Thank you. Outside of the European Union, for example, in Serbia, are there any countries in particular that Serbia takes example from and uses as role models in terms of energy transition?
I'm not sure of whether they are role models, but for sure Serbia's goal is to enter EU, to become full member. So I guess EU is a overall model and should look up to and follow its rules and regulation, and over time to try to reach them, and more importantly to implement, because we have been suffering very obvious climate change in the past few years. The temperature is rising. We have been suffered huge floods. So we already become vulnerable. People are feeling that the climate is changing, there's something has to be done. So we don't have to look too far for role models. EU is just our next door, so we should find it there.
And within the EU, I will probably not misinform anyone. At least it seems to me that the Netherlands is the country that is of most concern and has this alarmed state of concern about the climate change. And Nevena, you just mentioned floods. Maybe maybe Dinant Drankier can add a couple of words from the Dutch example. What does the country do?
Well, the Netherlands is in the position that a large percentage of the country is below the sea level. So as a Dutchman, you learn how to live with the water. Sea level rises, but also flooding risks from rivers. They make that additional effort also needs to be made in the field of climate adaptation. And in our case, it's really a lot of waterworks which need to be made in order to keep the Netherlands safe and dry. And it's also a skill that you see now worldwide is increasingly in demand. For example, in the US, but also beyond. Dutch water builders, water companies are increasingly taking a role in building dikes over there and increasing resilience of societies against water dangers.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for this fruitful and very interesting, enriching discussion. I hope you also enjoyed and learned something. Just to add on a positive note, maybe Marcus, you can wrap it all up.
Well, I would say certainly the willingness to change the energy systems and to think differently is more and more there. Very positive, I think, is also that the costs of a lot of renewable energies have come down significantly. Solar and wind are becoming really, really competitive. Again, this is due to people trying to improve the technologies, thinking differently. If you look at how the actual wind rotor blades are designed now, it is significantly different to what the designs were just 20 years ago. So you see optimized kit everywhere being much more fit for purpose. So if we keep along this path of seeing technology certainly as aiding us in all these processes and not something that we should shy away from. Plus, if we get societies in the Western world to do a little bit of less NIMBYism and really implement the technologies much more efficiently that already exist, where we're currently hampered, then we will be able to move forward faster. So there are many, many positive signs already. And we are in France here. There's the famous sort of morosité, which is a bit like the Hungarian, the glass is always half empty. I think just with a also sort of spirit of mind, which is more along the Brazilian, that the glass is always half full, we can actually achieve a lot more.
Thank you very much for being here with me today. I would just like briefly remind the listeners that this episode was brought to you and fully supported by the United Europe, the organization and initiatives that stands for European values, looks up to the bright European future, promotes the diversity and youth participation. We've been recording this episode from Paris, France, and stay tuned for more. Thank you for being here with us today. Goodbye.